we will do this, the agenda is that we will do the report presentation. And while the report belongs to all three of us, we will all present the piece of work that we have principally worked, but don't get fooled by this. The report belongs to everybody. It's just that some people are taking the lead on certain things. And then we have a number of keynotes. Stefano Grassi, the head of cabinet for Commissioner Patrick Simpson. Szymon Bielinski from the Polish Ministry of Climate and Environment, and I hope Szymon can hear us. And then Markus Pieper, the MEP from Germany, rapporteur for the revision of Renewable Energy Directive. Following that, what we will go into roundtable discussion, and the roundtable discussion we have invited and have agreed Adolfo Yellow from Europair, David Berman from LDC, Floris Van Hobel from Shell, Pauline Mathieu from Dynamics, and Rainer Kutzo from RIFS. So having said all this, I think that we will dispense with all the welcomes from all three organizations, because I think that may take a little bit too long and it's kind of stop us on the track. So let's start with our presentation, and then we can go into discussion. So I will start, and then we'll pass it on as we move on. So if you want to put a presentation on, and hopefully that works. Always holding my breast. Okay, can you make it presentation? Okay. All right, so if you are on the right plane, it is the 2024 State of the European Hydrogen Market report. If you want to go to the next slide. Now, what this report is, it's very much for those of you who have been around Brussels and have been around ERCST and BNEF and some other organizations that we work with, we have produced something called the State of the ETS report. And that was something that started as a very small effort many years ago. Started alone as myself, then ERCST when it got bigger. And then we got partners, Bloomberg and others working on that. And we thought it was a great idea. And at some point, one of my colleagues who's in the room now, Antonio, had the idea of having a state of the hydrogen market report. And I think we went around for about a year and a half until we had actually finally decided to do something about it. And at that time, I'm not quite sure. I think we were having a discussion with Martin Lambert and others, I think, and then we decided that let's talk to our partners and Bloomberg, and kind of come up with this report, which is the first off. We have worked inside the ERCST as a team with pretty much Olivier Imbeau here that has taken the lead for ERCST because he knows more about hydrogen than I'll ever know, but also Gabriele Rubio and Chiara Caprera. But then with the colleagues from Bloomberg and Oxford, and I rediscovered some old friends that way and made some new friends. It was a very interesting process because we all bring different things to the operation. Now, what we ended up is with a table of contents, and this is what usually comes first. And the table of content is you have the report will be issued following this meeting, but there will be key takeaways. There's a background, of course, introduction to hydrogen, because the report is being written itself as not a report for public consumption. It's very much written for people that are doing policy, people who understand the stuff, know it, and as such can understand some of the subtleties. Hopefully, it can be read by the majority of people. You don't have to be a wonk to understand this, but you still have to have to know something about hydrogen, or otherwise it's going to be difficult to read it. The third section is on regulatory developments, and we looked at EU regulatory development and UK regulatory development. We're kind of aware of the fact that the UK is not part of Europe anymore, but we saw that we're close enough that it's important to do, and there's a lot to be learned from the UK experience and the way the UK is developing its market. We also made a conscientious decision not to do the whole world. because I think there are other institutions that also use things like that. But also, I think that for the first exercise, we restrained ourselves to EU. We look at similarities and differences between the UK and the EU, and some insight on international dimension, but again, not a deep dive and kind of pretend to this being a global report. The one thing that we discussed with our colleagues, and this is because we learned from the state of the ETS, is KPIs. How do you judge this thing? I mean, we write this report in ETS, we wrote this report for years, and slowly we migrated to coming up with KPIs. What is the success? What is it making progress? Is it not making progress? Is the right track? Is not the right track? What is going on? So this is why we insisted very much on having hydrogen economy KPIs. And for some reason, we decided to separate the environmental delivery because in the end, it is driven right now by environmental concern. The hydrogen economy is driven by environmental concern, by the decarbonization. And as such, the environmental delivery is not unimportant. And last but not least is the market sentiment survey. Again, something that we do in the state of the but also something that we feel would give us a sense of what people think. It's not a scientific sample. It is not a scientific sample, but it is nevertheless a sample of people that we know in the business. And the three organizations, I think we have enough of a network and enough knowledge between ourselves that we can actually go ahead and make a selection of people, and you'll see the result on this. Now, the way we will work on this. So, if you want to skip now on the background, because I think I spoke to that. And now what we'll do is the introduction to hydrogen. I think Martin Lambert. So Martin, I'm passing it on to you.
Okay, thanks very much, and hello everyone. First of all, just to say on behalf of the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, it's been great to be involved in this report. And sorry that Alex and I can't be with you in person today. Just the logistics of getting to Brussels just seemed a bit too difficult. But so just very briefly, this is one slide on everything about hydrogen. There's more detail in the report itself. But essentially, this sets the framework for what we look at in the KPIs. So the first one about government policy, that's the reason why in much of the report, there's quite a lot of focus on the regulatory side, because we see that as being essential to drive investments and growth of the hydrogen economy. Then the next few bullets talk about our focus on the overall supply chain, because we've seen in some places there's focus just on one part of like hydrogen production or hydrogen consumption. But the perspective we're taking is you need to look along the whole supply chain. So starting with the end use sectors. And so we'll be tracking, as you'll see in the KPIs, where are the off-takers headed? Similarly, on production routes, that long-standing debate on blue versus green. And we also note we should include nuclear in the electrolytic hydrogen, but we'll be tracking how much hydrogen production is being committed from where. And underpinning both of those, both the production and the consumption side, the challenge of cost and scale can't be underestimated. So we make some comments on costs. We're tracking with interest what happened with the European Hydrogen Bank, and we'll carry on tracking that as we go forward. Finally, the bit in the middle, midstream, I've often said I think storage has received not enough focus, because if we're going to be balancing intermittent production with steady state offtake, it becomes really important to have some storage as a buffer in between. So all of that is just a very brief intro to say, in this report, we're tracking the entire supply chain, and there are lots of challenges to be addressed. And really, we see the aim of this report is to be tracking how we're getting on across Europe in tracking those challenges. So I'll stop there and move on to the regulatory piece.
We'll move on to regulatory and European regulatory developments. Olivier?
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Martin. Okay, my role today is to give you a quick overview of the EU regulatory development, okay? And we'll have only one slide. One slide, I mean, to summarize at least 1,000 page of regulation. So it's quite, let's say, synthetic. I will do that, and after I will give the floor to Alex for the UK regulatory framework. But before, I would like to thank Chiara because, let's say, she has done a lot, I mean, to build all those slides and this summary. So that's my, let's say, personal thanks, Chiara. And all our partners, because, I mean, in this discussion, we were three, and I can tell you that it's quite interesting, I mean, to have the vision of three people who are not coming from the same experience. So thanks, I mean, Bloomberg and thanks also, because I mean, the experience of UK is quite, let's say, enlightening when you try to understand how was built the regulatory system in Europe. So the EU framework, coming to the EU framework, is quite complex, and Hygiene has no specific regulation within the EU framework. It's, let's say, included in all the regulations. So it's give you, let's say, the obligation to go and follow all the regulation of the Fit for 55 package. I assume that you are all experts and that we will, let's say, obviously move on the modification which were done on the Fit for 55 package and the modification which regard the hygiene in 2023. That is the scope of the, let's say, presentation. We do not have, let's say, the ambition to say something about the state of play. And what could we see today? We see that there is, let's say, a fantastic and incredible, let's say, improvement, important progress in 2023. Considering that the EU hygiene framework, and that's my, let's say, vision, is based on two pillars, renewable and the carbon market. So it's quite important, I mean, to see that, because, I mean, that it is not, as we said, because, I mean, we did not debate that, but we are addressing the low carbon island. Within the low carbon island, we have the renewables, and the renewable is, let's say, obviously addressed by the regulation in the EU. And there is a specific push for renewable in the EU. But the specific push is linked to the carbon market, which is quite interesting because, I mean, it's giving price, I mean, to the carbon. And that could be one thing which is important for the introduction of hydrogen, but maybe not enough. We will see that, and we will have, let's say, all the slides on that. So what happened in 2023? In 2023, we had the famous way to delegated act application. We were waiting that for maybe 2 years. To discuss with Ruud, but we were waiting for that. That is quite important because, I mean, we had the rule for the classification of the renewable hydrogen. We were waiting for that, the additionality, the temporal correlation, the geographic correlation. Those are the three pillars, which are, by the way, discussing in the state, because, I mean, they still have, let's say, to decide that. That was quite important. And we have the carbon methodology to measure the carbon footprint, and that is quite important because, I mean, for the first time, I mean, we have seen that we were, let's say, really well, or I think we were, let's say, having a really good definition of the life cycle mechanism. So based on that, after we had the RED III with new set of criteria and implication on the hydrogen market, because new set of criteria and new set of target for hydrogen, in industry, in transport. We had the consequences that you could see on the slide on the maritime, on the aviation. So it was really a full set of, let's say, regulations which were, let's say, aiming to push the hydrogen market. Then, with that, we had the evolution of the ETS. The ETS and the first, let's say, apparition of CBAM, ETS plus CBAM, so the future of ETS, or at least the thing which is linked to ETS. And hydrogen, at all surprise, because we had a lot of other discussion, was in CBAM. The period, I mean, in CBAM at the end of all the discussion. We were a little bit surprised, but we were in CBAM, hydrogen. And that gave a lot of, let's say, consequences, because you have the phasing out of the EUA in the ETS. You have the new benchmark for hydrogen. So you have a new, let's say, application, consequences, impact of these ETS and CBAM for hydrogen. Regarding the funding support, big announcement between these three, because we had the new mechanism of the hydrogen bank auction based on the innovation fund, but it was really a breakthrough. I mean, for that, because we were waiting to understand how the project which were not in the innovation fund could be subsidized. So you had this mechanism now, which is in place. A little bit complex, because at least it is done. And another thing which is quite important, at least for us, is the Net Zero Industry Act. Because we were discussing now for the industrial strategy in Europe for more than 10 years. When I was in Business Europe, I remember that each time that we had the name industrial strategy, for me, was taboo. But for the first time, I mean, we had maybe the possibility to push the technology which are strategic, and hydrogen and the hydrogen technology are considered as strategic, and is on the new nation industrial strategy for EU, which is the Net Zero Industry. So it's quite important, because we could have a certain push. So that is, let's say, the state of play of 2023. If you could go to, however, we still need, I mean, some other thing to really have the creation, the deployment of the hydrogen market in the EU. And some element of the further licensing and questions are raised about the effectiveness of the current framework. What are the first, let's say, elements which are missing and which are important for the certainty of the project? The first question is, how is built the EU mechanism? The EU mechanism is built on two layers. There is one, which is the EU, and the EU has done its job. We will see that there are some pieces which are missing, but the EU has done its job. Now, we need to implement that. And the member state should take the relay, the baton. And we are still, let's say, missing in some place the implementing act of those directives and all those regulations. So there is a lot of discussion with the member, for example, about how could be transposed the directive in Poland, how is transposed in Germany, how is transposed in France. Yesterday, I was discussing with the French government, and they want to discuss with the German government in order to be aligned in their, let's say, mechanism of support, because they do have another type of support for each country. So for those who are investing, they need to have some clarification at this level, and that is missing. We can't ask, let's say, obviously, to the EU to push, but at least, I mean, that is a member state. There are other part of the element which are, let's say, belonging to the EU, which are missing, and that is, let's say, the famous definition and certification of the low carbon hydrogen. We were waiting for that, as we were waiting for the renewable hydrogen definition. We think that we will have something in, let's say, 1 year, but we need to, let's say, push to get that. So that are, let's say, some parts which are missing. But that is not, let's say, only the only issue. There are issues on how those projects could be, let's say, competitive enough, could be attractive enough, and is the, let's say, current regulatory framework addressing these aspects. So the first thing is, let's say, the price. I mean, we still have, let's say, a big difference between the green technology and renewable hydrogen price and the other option. There are some discussion about how to, let's say, extend the possibility of the technology, because there is, let's say, some difficulty to have the, let's say, supply and the production of, let's say, those new product based on hydrogen, because the industry needed 24 hours delivery. So we could have, let's say, the possibility maybe to use, let's say, other technology to complement renewable, but they are not in the target. So there are discussions about the target. We need to include the low carbon in the target. That's the question. And then you have, let's say, all the discussion about the technology neutral mechanism. So we were, let's say, trying to, let's say, address one point, which is quite important if we want to get this market deployed, is the big consumer. The big consumer are industry. They need large volume of hydrogen, and they need obviously large volume of hydrogen 24 hours. So that is something which has to be obviously implemented in the regulation. Increasing support, we have discussed that, because I mean we need to have at least a support which is at least at the level of our ambition. And when you look at the ambition, and when you look at, and we see that with the benchmark, with the Bloomberg, the ambition of the, let's say, EU power was 20 million tons of hydrogen. The, let's say, objective of RED are 3 or 4, or maybe less.
2 to 4 or something.
Yeah. So there is a disconnection between the tools, which will give you 2 to 4 million tons, and the ambition, which are 20. So we need obviously to address. So I close here, and I will, let's say, give the floor to Alex.
So Alex, you will now have covered this, the new regulatory, and then the next two slides. So Alex, can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
So go ahead, please.
Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So the UK has also got a hydrogen strategy and hydrogen targets like the EU, but has gone about it in a slightly different way. So a major milestone last year was the passing of the Energy Act, which effectively put in place the legislation enabling various initiatives. And that includes government support mechanisms for hydrogen production and also for carbon capture, use and storage, which is necessary in the hydrogen context because the UK is also supporting so-called blue hydrogen. It gives the government the power to implement a levy on natural gas network users to help finance the subsidy of hydrogen production. That's not in place yet, but the power is now there. It creates the ultimate regulatory framework for hydrogen and CO2 transportation and storage, provides for strategic infrastructure planning for energy, and that includes hydrogen, and also gives the government the legal powers for trials of hydrogen in home heating. So although the act was only passed at the end of last year, in fact, a lot of the development work has been going on prior to this. And so some of these mechanisms are now in place, which I'll now go on to explain. Next slide, please. So the main element of the UK strategy is production support. So unlike the EU, which has set targets for RFMBOs, the UK has targets, but they're not set in stone. They're not set in legislation, but it aims to stimulate hydrogen production through support via the so-called hydrogen production business model. This is effectively a contract for difference type model, although it's a bit more complicated than the ones you see for electricity because, of course, there is no market reference price. Instead, it uses a reference price based on the natural gas price. And effectively, it enables projects to bid for government support so that they get a fixed price if they don't manage to sell the hydrogen at the price they would need to make a return on their investments. Now, the first projects were awarded support in December 2023. This is through the so-called hydrogen allocation round mechanism, which is effectively a kind of auction, but only in the loosest sense of the word, because it's not a pure price auction. There are a number of other factors in place, and that largely reflects the nascent nature of the market. And 125 megawatts of electrolytic capacity was awarded support. They're currently holding HAR2 at the moment, which hopes to award another 875 megawatts of capacity support, with the aim that there'll be a gigawatt of low carbon hydrogen production, in this case electrolytic, up and running in the mid to late 2020s. The other thing that was announced during a sort of fairly comprehensive update to the market in December was the way that the government intends to develop hydrogen infrastructure. So for hydrogen transport networks, very, very small infrastructure, basically where the production and demand are pretty close to each other, will probably be financed through the hydrogen production business model. But larger networks will be financed using a regulated asset-based model and government support if there isn't sufficient demand for the networks in the early stages, whereas storage will have a revenue support model which effectively acts as a floor, so that if they don't make enough commercial sales, they know they'll get a low rate of return on the capital invested. Now, the precise details of that business model are still being finalized, but there's been a lot of work on that. And then demand, as I said, there aren't specific targets set out in legislation for use of low carbon hydrogen. But if you want to get support under the hydrogen production business model, you need to have an offtake agreement in place. The government took a decision in principle to allow blending of hydrogen into gas distribution networks. But there are going to be further technical studies to determine the level of that. So it's unlikely to happen before, say, 2025. As far as hydrogen use in sort of low temperature heat, so space heating, there has been no decision yet, though I think it unlikely that it will get support because of the competition from other sources of low carbon heating. So, for example, the head of the National Infrastructure Commission has said the government should rule it out because it doesn't make any sense. That's hydrogen in space heating. And last but not least, standards. So the UK has a low carbon hydrogen standard. It's technology neutral. In other words, they don't care how you produce your hydrogen so long as it has a carbon intensity of less than 20 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. But it's important to notice that that's only on a well-to-gate basis. And the reason for that is this is principally the means by which they ensure that those projects which are getting support under the hydrogen production business model meet a required quality standard. So it's not like the EU RFMBO, which is a well-to-wheel. And the UK is not anticipating imports of hydrogen, or at least not in the sense that they're going to give them any kind of support, which again is another difference from what the EU is looking at, or certain member states in the EU are looking at. So next slide. So in terms of comparing the UK and the EU approach. Apologies, the first box should be the other way around. It's the EU, which is a political and economic union of 27 member states, not the UK. Anyway, the main difference here is that the UK, it has all the powers it can, in one place. So effectively, it is able to put in place a policy that covers everything from regulations, standards, subsidy mechanisms, etc. Whereas the EU, as we heard earlier, there are a number of acts in place, but of course, it's then up to the member states as to how they implement them. So take the target for RFMBOs, that sets the target at an EU level, but it's up to the member states as to how they're going to meet that target. The other key difference is that the UK has taken a more technology neutral approach. So for example, as I mentioned, it supports low carbon hydrogen, both based on electrolysis using renewable electricity, as well as using nuclear electricity or fossil fuels with CCS. The EU to date has been much more focused on the renewable energy route, although, of course, now that we have the hydrogen and gas decarbonisation package approved, we will now get a definition for low carbon hydrogen. But notably, whilst there is a target for RFMBOs, there isn't a target in the new package for low carbon hydrogen. I've already mentioned about the difference between the definitions, the well to wheel versus the well to gate. The other thing is that the UK is noticeably stricter in terms of measuring the carbon intensity of hydrogen. As I said, they don't mind where it comes from, but they measure its intensity based on 30-minute production batches. So then your electricity carbon intensity for that 30-minute period will obviously determine the carbon intensity of your hydrogen. Whereas the EU, and we know there have been lots of debates and discussion about this, has temporal correlation of 1 month until 2030 and then hourly thereafter. Obviously, there's been a lot of debate on that, and happy to talk about that more later in the discussion. And then a couple of things on the international side. This is a European report, so EU plus UK, but it's worth noting, as I'm sure you're all aware, that the US has got the Inflation Reduction Act, and as was mentioned earlier, they are consulting on their proposed rules for low carbon hydrogen, or as they call it, clean hydrogen definitions for the 45B tax credit. And then, as we know, China has also been doing quite a lot in the hydrogen space and is a major electrolyzer manufacturer. So I'll leave it there.
Very good. Thank you, Alex. Now we come to the part with the graphs. The hydrogen economy KPIs. We consulted as much as we could. We came with the first batch of them. Then we listened to some stakeholders. I think we did a little bit of a correction, but nevertheless, it is work in progress. I think we're learning. This is the first year we do this. Ali, you have the floor.
Yeah,
I think everybody's anxiously waiting for this.
and yeah, on that, like, do feel free to let us know if you feel like there's something we should be tracking that we're not at the moment. As Andre says, very much work in progress. What we've decided as part of the multiple stakeholder consultations that we have, we settled on 9 KPIs that go across 4 categories. And I'll go through each one of them. The first one is targets and incentives, where we in terms of target setting, supply, demand, and then lastly, electrolyzer manufacturing. Our first KPI on targets and on national electrolyzer targets in particular, we try to compare how national targets stack up against EU level targets that we have. And to the best of our knowledge, including the updated national energy climate plans that we have with updated electrolyzer targets, we see European member states together add up to about 54 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity that they want to install by 2030. This is more than the original EU hydrogen strategy target for 40 gigawatts. But then if you look at REPowerEU and look at the 10 million metric tons of domestic production that the REPowerEU is targeting, and translate that into a domestic electrolyzer deployment target, this could vary, of course, depending on efficiency and utilization assumptions. But if you assume that's about 125 gigawatts, you can see national targets don't really stack up to the REPowerEU goal overall. And I think it's a story that you will see throughout our slide deck that REPowerEU targets in itself by 2030, at least within that timeframe, will be really relatively hard to reach. If you move on to the next slide, this looks at government funding allocations across the world, not just in the EU, but aggregates funding across EU member states and the European Union in that second bar. And what we found is that if you aggregate it this way, the EU plus its member states together are one of the largest funders of low carbon hydrogen. So we're pretty much doing really well in that terms. I think because it has been a discussion point before, an important thing to highlight here is the US and how we measure the US and the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. This is very much an estimate by us that is based on the project pipeline and assuming that project pipeline that has been announced until 2030 actually receives a tax credit. We did this because the US doesn't really have a budget for its tax credit. So in theory, the spending on it is limitless. But in practice, it's constrained by how many projects actually go ahead. So it could be very much lower than what the EU will end up spending or higher. That's still an open question. This just illustrates there will be a lot of financial might also in the US behind project spending. And how much that will be depends on what share of these projects will actually go ahead. We move on to the next. Now we come to supply. What this looks at is the production in Europe that we consider committed, by which I mean operational or past the final investment decision, versus what has been announced, including by the color of that hydrogen. So whether that's electrolytic or whether that's with fossil fuels, with CCS, mostly natural gas-based blue hydrogen. And what you can see here is that out of the pipeline of announcements until 2030, for projects that want to commission until 2030, just 3.6% of that pipeline is either already operational or has taken a final investment decision across Europe. The picture becomes better in the EU, but only because announced pipeline is smaller in just the EU member states. Pretty much all the investments so far are really happening in EU member states anyway. About 600,000 tons of hydrogen that you see past a final investment decision or operational already. Also interesting to note, in terms of the color of the bar, more of this is blue hydrogen than it is electrolytic hydrogen today to permitted supply. A lot of that based on retrofits in the Netherlands, for example, we saw Air Products and Air Liquide take final investment decision over the last year. Those are relatively large projects in terms of hydrogen output, and therefore they sort of have more output than what you see on the electrolytic side so far. If you move on to the next slide, we also did a global comparison. So how does the EU stack up in terms of supply, committed supply versus the US and China? Just two ways of comparing commitments to hydrogen. And what you can see here is that in overall supply terms, the US leads in terms of how many investments have been taken. 1.3 million tons of hydrogen supply, mostly blue hydrogen, is already past the final investment decision or operational. Most of them past FID rather than operational. The EU in total supply is second, and then China is third in terms of global supply of low carbon hydrogen. What you can also see here, China also leads on electrolytic hydrogen production. So there's more electrolyzer capacity actually deployed and producing hydrogen than Europe does. So Europe is somewhere in the middle between the two other major regions where we'll see low carbon hydrogen deployment.
Europe, including the UK.
Yeah. We haven't really seen any FIDs from the projects that are in funding negotiations, and you can just why you won't really see much funding yet. Now we come to the demand side. So what we do at BNEF, and this is some of the data we have used here, is to track offtake agreements at different stages. So we looked at every announcement for offtake discussion. Let's say that's an MOU, an LOI, or a binding agreement. And what this chart shows is that all the supply that has been announced that is in some form of offtake discussion, on the left-hand side by the source, the production origin. So what we find is that of the 6 million tons almost of hydrogen that is in offtake discussions with European buyers, about half is from overseas suppliers and the other half is from domestic production, actually more on the import side right now. So more import offtakes currently in discussion than from domestic production. On the right-hand side here, you see the same domestic part, just put it against domestic production announced for commissioning until 2030. And what you see here is that whether you compare it to the REPowerEU goal or whether you compare it to the announced domestic supply, just a very small fraction of that is even in an offtake discussion or has identified a buyer publicly and stated that they have they are negotiating with a certain company on offtake. Which gives you one of the major areas of improvement we think is on the offtake side, that we don't see enough projects actually entering offtake discussions and then turning them into binding agreements. What then this looks at is taking these offtake discussions and then splitting that into the share of non-binding agreements and then binding agreements that we found within them. And what you find is that the vast majority is still at a non-binding stage. These are term sheets, LOIs, MOUs of some form. And with just almost 1 million tons at a binding stage with a European buyer. So just 4.5% of the supply needed to meet the REPowerEU target has signed a binding offtake agreement in our view so far. Most of those, if you look at the offtake sectors on here, or the buying industries, are from things like steel, shipping, what else do you have? Aviation. So these are the first sectors that are actually turning offtake discussions into binding agreement. And then a big chunk also that we consider unspecified because we don't know what the use of the hydrogen will be. That could be a chemicals company that is still figuring out whether this will go into fertilizers or into something else. We move on. We're also tracking quotas as part of our KPIs because we think quotas are key to turning non-binding agreements into binding agreements on the offtake side, and the penalties behind them in particular. Our estimation at the moment is that quotas itself, the way they're set through, whether that's through RED III or through the aviation and shipping quotas that are set separately through regulation, will lead to somewhere between 2 to 4 million tons of offtake demand for 2030. That's of course assuming once RED III quotas are implemented on a national level. There's potential upside to that through new industries that are not using hydrogen today, like the steel industry, which could raise the demand for hydrogen, for RFNBO hydrogen. But this is where we land today. So even regulatory drivers, in a way, are currently not strong enough to meet the targets that we're setting out, whether through, for example, through REPowerEU. Lastly, we looked at electrolyzer sales and manufacturing in Europe, particularly as the discussion now is quite strong around whether the next hydrogen bank auction should have non-price criteria for domestic electrolyzer manufacturers and favoring domestic electrolyzer manufacturers in some way. So one thing we did is we looked historically at the sales of electrolyzers to European projects. And if you just split that by the share of which, the capacities by which come from European suppliers versus non-European suppliers, today the influence of foreign suppliers on European projects is still very much small. So overall, today, for the last 2 years or so, European projects are buying European electrolyzers. 80–90% of sales, pretty much, in Europe are from European manufacturers as well. If you go to the next slide, this could, of course, change. This chart looks at announced manufacturing capacities, stack assembly capacities for electrolyzers, and looks at the share of Europe versus non-Europe. Most of the non-European part is in China. So if you look at the manufacturing base, most of it is not based in Europe. So what we see as a potential outcome of this is that over time, we'll see more and more influence of non-European manufacturers also in European projects as we see sales grow overall. So there is a potential threat of non-European manufacturers making it into European projects. Today, we have not actually seen that happen. Finally, just go to one slide. This is just a summary. This will be in the report in terms of how we're moving ahead across all these indicators. Overall, to summarize, what we'll say is that we would think Europe has made low to moderate progress on most of these 9 KPIs, but particularly we need a lot more action on the supply and demand side, turning project announcements into FIDs and then offtake negotiations into binding offtakes. That's where we see mostly the lag in terms of progress in the hydrogen industry. Pass back.
Thank you. We'll come back and there will be opportunities. We'll try and keep this on ice, and we need to come back to the graphs. So when you discuss, we'd be happy to put the graphs back on the table. Now, this are KPI for the hydrogen economy. We separated for some bizarre reasons from the environmental delivery. Probably we shouldn't have, but we did. So in terms of environmental delivery, Olivier and Gabriele?
Thank you again, Andre. So why we have included this section? I mean, we were trying to understand what was the impact of the hydrogen deployment. Since the hydrogen is considered as key for the decarbonization. So what is the hydrogen impact on the emission saving? Obviously, I mean, we are at the beginning, so we are not expecting a lot as a result. But we were trying, and Gabriele Romeo has done, let's say, a lot of work on that. We were trying, I mean, to build 4 KPIs where, in order to follow that. So you will see it's a work in progress because we do not have the history, but we will take that for the future. So I leave the floor to Gabriele for, let's say, giving you some inside view of the 4 KPI.
Thanks, Olivier. That is true for all of them. I mean, right now you have some history and some time series. Hopefully there will be more of these reports. The frequency will yet to be determined, but you'll see.
Let's move to the next slide. I'm going to run you through the KPIs we have developed for the chapter. KPI 5.1, as you can see in the figure, we have estimated total emissions from hydrogen production in Europe at roughly 55 megatons of CO2 equivalent. And that's roughly equal for a comparison to Ireland's 22 emissions overall. If we look at the sectoral shares of these emissions, we have ammonia and refining that account for roughly 80% of total emissions, and this period reflects their higher consumption volumes. If we look at the same KPI from a production technology perspective, we see that basically virtually all of these emissions come from SMR without CCS, and partial oxidation and abated SMR, so SMR with CCS, is only in the kiloton range, so it's negligible. Moving on to the next KPI.
Just a consideration, you may be surprised by the 55 million tons, because maybe you have in mind, let's say, 8 million tons of hydrogen today multiplied by 10 million tons, but with the thorough discussion with Bloomberg, with Ober, we have excluded the hydrogen as a byproduct. So
KPI 5.2 refers to refining ammonia, methanol, and other chemicals from the database we've used, which is the European Hydrogen Observatory, and the data are from 2022. And more specifically, the KPI looks at the emission savings enabled by the rollout of low carbon hydrogen, meaning electrolytic plus abated, in the sectors. So total emission savings in this KPI amount to 130 kilotons of CO2, and this reflects the low penetration of low carbon hydrogen in traditional consuming sectors. You can see in the top left figure that CCS is used by now the only refining, and electrolytic hydrogen is used in all the sectors. The KPI below 5.3 extends the previous KPI by including emission savings in steel making, mobility, residential heat, and other industries. Total emissions in this case, of course, increase to 277 kilotons of CO2, but we also estimate that they could have been as high as 377 had mobility and residential heat being directly rectified instead. So we identify an opportunity cost here, although we specify in the report that we have the assumption that there is full substitutability, which may not be the case. Moving on to the last KPI, the 2022 share of RFMBio hydrogen EU industry is estimated at 0.2% of total consumption, as you can see in the table. And this compares to the 2030 target of 42% without discounts. This implies that keeping 2022 total consumption fixed, RFMBio hydrogen consumption in industry should roughly double every year. So we have a compounded annual growth rate of 95% until 2030 in order to meet the target. Yeah, that's all. For the chapter, all the assumptions and sources are in the report. And we
Gabriel, thanks. Yeah, you're up down the bat now. We have the market sentiment survey. Again, there is no time series in here because the first time you run this. Presumably the story in this ought to be, as you see, a progression of information, but this is what we have right now. So Chiara, go ahead, you worked on this, would like to hear, there you go.
So we carried out a market sentiment survey among stakeholders and market players, and our goal was to see what stakeholders think about the hydrogen market and the regulatory framework. The sample that we have here is not a scientific sample. So as you can see in the first graph, respondents are divided on whether the EU regulations in their current setup are supporting the creation of the EU hydrogen economy. While regarding the UK, most of the survey participants think that the UK regulations are succeeding in this. While in the third graph, we can see that according to the respondents, the EU should consider a more technology neutral approach. When it comes to REPower EU green hydrogen target, most of the respondents think that the target of 20 million tons of green hydrogen by 2030 will not be met. And this figure is, let's say, slightly less negative on the UK strategy, although the majority of survey participants doubted that the ambition of this UK hydrogen strategy will be met. Then regarding RED III, surprisingly, the majority of respondents agree that the directive is supporting the uptake of hydrogen, both in the industry and the transport sector. While about financing, the EU member states, including the UK, that has a more conducive public funding framework is Germany, followed by the UK. And finally, in the last graph, we can see that it confirms that the EU that currently has a negative approach should consider a more flexible approach when defining hydrogen emission, like the UK and its well-to-gate approach. You can find more insights in the report, but to briefly summarize, these are the findings that from the survey.
Yeah, let's move on to the takeaways, and I think it's what people will usually read the takeaway of the executive summary. But I think you'll see the report is, I think, an interesting report with a lot of data. You've seen the amount of the wealth of data that was produced and information, and the summary of the regulatory part. So the report is, we wanted to hear also the reaction today. The report is closed, but we'll probably finish it by tomorrow night, probably issue it by Monday morning. So you'll get an email with that on Monday morning with the full report. And that report is going to have attached this deck of slides to it, because I think it's useful to have that. Now the takeaways, look, I think we all come from different backgrounds in this group, and for me, I saw that the ETS was complicated in terms of regulatory machine, but this is a bloody complicated story. I admire those people who remember all this stuff. I'm not one of them. So to me, the first thing that I said is that the hydrogen economy, there are a number of things that you want to do 2050, you want to do 2040, all this stuff. Hydrogen is part of it, CCS part of it, renewable. There's a number of things that you need to be able to do. And this is an important part of it. In my view, and this is kind of speaking now strongly for ERCST, we think it's an overly regulatory market. It is, especially the EU side, it is really regulatory. We think that the UK is still a little bit more market oriented and more technology neutral, but nothing is perfect in life. There are key elements that is still missing. I think Olivier has spoken to those. we said that, you know, the UK is more technology neutral, but again, nothing is perfect. The fact that we are not moving as fast as we can, and you saw some of the results of the survey. Question is, are we going to really hit the targets? Is that going to deliver the environmental benefits that we're waiting for? The progress that has been made, I think that you have seen that there's Olivier's view and that expressed by the report that the EU and the EU level, we have made good progress. There's still stuff to be done. Probably some of this thing that needs to be done now is some of it at the member state level that needs to be adjusted. Okay. Now, the fact that Europe has announced one of the largest budgets, that is clear after the US. I think the one thing that I just thinking when I was reading this, you saw different graphs with different amounts. Be interesting to normalize it for something for the size of the economy or something. I'm not sure how to do that, but it's, you know, obviously the EU and the US look big if you look compared to Japan, but Japan, I think, announced recently a very important initiative as well. There is further progress required on implementing quotas for hydrogen and the use and expanding domestic electrolyzer manufacturing. We see that the Chinese are expanding and strongly in the process of setting themselves up to dominate this market as well. Something that as Europeans, obviously, we are concerned about. You know, we don't think that Europe can be prosperous without an industrial base. The key indicators, progress indicator over the next 12 months is how many from the project which won first EU Hydrogen Bank auction actually progress. And if significant FID are taken on UK low carbon hydrogen project, finally, how many firm offtake agreements are signed between customers and suppliers. So these are some of the things that we'll be watching. Now, it is a first report. We are learning from it. I think as Olivier has mentioned, and you know, we threw Chiara a little bit in the deep end on this because she's quite new in here. Gabriele has been with us and is actually working on his thesis right now. So they have contributed quite a lot. It's been a great pleasure working with the two other organizations. It's fun doing this stuff, and it's the nice part of working in a think tank. It's the nice part. The not so nice part is looking for money and looking for people to come and speak on panels. That's not a nice part. The intellectual part is the nice part, and last but not least, working with Olivier, who again, I know a lot about many things. So hydrogen is not my forte. So I think we went a little bit longer than we thought. I don't think so. I know so, because we wanted to finish this faster, but we haven't been supremely helpful. Now, we'll if we can in some way, get the other two the speakers, Stefano Grassi. Stefano, if you want to join us in some way here, and then I have Shimon Belinsky and also our member of parliament, Mr. Piper. I think what I'll do is I'll reverse because I think, Mr. Piper, I think you have given us a window, and I think we have abused that window a little bit. So with all due respect, if that's okay, I'll go to you, Mr. Piper, first. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
And again, thank you very much for having patience with us today. The best plans get lost in the fog of war. So thank you very much for joining us and taking the time.
You're welcome. Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Marco. Firstly, thank you for inviting me to your roundtable on climate change and sustainable transition. I would like to combine my thanks with congratulations on your report, State of the EU Hydrogen Market. You have succeeded really in presenting a realistic picture of the hydrogen market and its future. Your study is as instructive as it is political, very political. Instructive because it assesses the technologies of hydrogen production. It is also instructive because we have an evaluation of infrastructure needs and logistic needs of the hydrogen business. Very interesting. And political, the study is valuable because it makes concrete recommendation and identifies priorities for action in the next legislative period. And top timing in the run-up of the European election. So let me make 5 comments on this, 5 points that I'm going to make based on my experience as rapporteur on the Renewable Energy Directive, which at least indirectly also involved the definition of green hydrogen. Firstly, on the financing of infrastructures and projects. For me, a much higher budget for the Connecting Europe facility is needed. For me, this is the most important European infrastructure financing program. This is crucial. Here you should also look at the structural funds. They have not been utilized. We have 200 billion blocked in 1+2, 1+3 rules. So there is unused money. And we also need to look more closely at the recovery fund. After all, it has obviously no cross-border projects today. Not only one hydrogen cross-border project funded by the recovery fund. And keep an eye, as you did on the European Hydrogen Bank. The first tender phase has worked, yes, but much more money is needed for the next tenders and steps. My second point, secondly, put pressure on the member states. Evaluate best practice for the development of the hydrogen economy in European countries and make recommendations to Brussels for a more harmonized approach. The blending rules in the Netherlands and the UK, for example, seem to work, but I see Germany, for example, as problematic. Okay, we have progress in infrastructure, in the backbone, but I think we neglect the decentralized distribution grids, and we neglect in Germany the strategic advantage of the gas network. My third point, underline that we have a functioning hydrogen infrastructure. There is also a better perspective for the expansion of the electricity grid. Functioning hydrogen grids can help to tackle the bottlenecks in the electricity grid. We need to see electrification and energy from hydrogen not as competition, but as win-win. Fourthly, make it clear that the energy transition in Europe cannot work without much more imports. Your calculation already show that we will not achieve the expansion targets. It will only work first with technological openness, you mentioned it. Yes, also with low carbon solutions. By the way, we would still achieve the Paris climate targets, of course, but with more low carbon solution, I think faster and more cost effectively. And keep an eye on, take advantage on the review options we provided in many, many Green Deal dossiers, the review options. I fear that we will not be able to meet the binding targets for green hydrogen in industry either. You mentioned your prognosis. Therefore, push for the review articles in the red for a definition of green hydrogen to be adapted if necessary. There is an extra article in the Renewable Energy Directive and in the Delegated Act how to define green hydrogen. So we have 2 possibilities to make things easier. And last but not least, for me, a decisive point, we need a vice president in the Commission with a comprehensive responsibility for hydrogen. There are many, many good approaches in the European Commission, but when it comes to binding target planning and definitions, if Global Gateway is to be a door opener for hydrogen, when it comes to standardization and infrastructure expansion in the EU, or when it comes to demanding stronger implementation in the member states, for example, in the case of RFNBOs, and of course, when it comes to financing from different budgets. The Commission have to manage all these challenges together, strategically, legislative, and in the implementation process. So a more centralized and a more binding coordination is required. Many things are running parallel in the Commission, and in some cases, they are even working against each other. Therefore, help to ensure that the energy transition and the hydrogen market become a top priority in the Commission's hierarchy, a top priority. Then you will be able to report on even greater progress in the next state of the hydrogen market in your next report. So once again, congratulations to Roundtable for the good timing ahead of the Commission's next working program, and all the best for your meeting today. Thank you very much. Have a nice and successful meeting.
Thank you very much for your kind words to all three of us that have worked on this. And to the extent that we can be helpful, it is our, I think, role here to try and be helpful and make this make progress on this important policy. I think we totally agree with you. I'm not sure, you know, I have no opinion on the vice president part, but certainly the importance that needs to be, the focus that needs to be put on this very important, necessary condition. I think we fully support everything you said. And again, thank you very much for taking the time, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Grassi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marco. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks again to ERCST for having me here with you today. And I will be more economical than the European Parliament. I will have only 4 points. And the first doesn't count as a full point because I want sincerely to congratulate you on an excellent report. Very well researched, a thorough analysis, complete. And I do that not because it comes as a surprise coming from such experienced researchers, because I think it's not only a contribution to research in this area, but I think it serves a more important purpose. Because at this particular moment in the debate on the progress of the Green Deal and the clean energy transition, and in particular on our hydrogen policy, there is a desperate need for an evidence-based and how can I say, data-based conversation. Because going forward, this issue, whether we are on track, whether all that we have done is adding up to something, is triggering the right type of projects, the right type of movement, will become very crucial. And you know how the European debate moves from over-enthusiasm to over self-deprecation, or where we started going off track for the targets, or what we can do. So I think having an evidence-based debate fed by substantial analysis, it's a great service to sound policy making. So I think your operation with this report. The second remark is more focused on the part of your report that Olivier Imbaud presented as the regulatory part and the regulatory development. It was synthesized on one side, but when you look at it, it's also in terms of pages, and I would say the density of this regulation is quite an impressive achievement. And I think what is important is that in the space of less than 3 years, this was completed. And I insist on this because I see a reference on a certain emphasis on possible gap. And I think that the essence of what should be the regulatory framework is there. The missing link, which is the delegated act on low carbon, is coming. We will start the consultation already before the summer. I think we are getting there. And I don't know if, because of a timeline of this delegated act, which requires, of course, both Council and Parliament to intervene, a long period of consultation, the possibility to extend it. I don't know if we will conclude it by the end of the year. It may slip into the next year, but I will say our firm intention is to say that in this Monday, at least we did our duty to present all the pieces of all the pieces of legislation. But the point I wanted to make when we look at the regulatory framework and the European regulatory framework is that I always have the impression that we have a tendency here in Europe to underestimate two elements. One, the level of the ambition that this effort of regulation had. And the second, the genesis of it, or basically, I would say the deep raison d'etre, the deep necessity for visa. I mean ambition, because what we tried to do, we set out to do when in 2021, if I'm correct, we started with the decarbonization of gas package. Was to set out an experiment in anticipatory legislation. We were the first in the world for an nascent economic sector. And what we wanted to do is to set out a framework before the market develops. And this because we had in mind the vision that by setting these rules early on, we can steer the development of the market in a direction that is not replicating some of the distortions, some of the difficulties and the challenges that existing energy markets like gas, natural gas market have. And so by setting already early on clearly rules on third-party access to network, on who can own the infrastructure, on the funding, the cross-subsidization between gas operators, we will steer the development of a competitive market where pure operators or quasi-pure operators like Air Liquide here, they can have a space, they can develop their area, and where we don't see these giants like in the natural gas sector or in other energy market, other fossil sectors, which occupies the market and took us possibly 15 to 20 years and 3 different packages of single market legislation to liberalize. So that was the original ambition. The second is that imagine, again, what was this involuntary mistake of inverting the European and the EU, but imagine if we had not done this. So if we had not done, we are bound as a European Union to start by regulation. It's what we say was an effort regulatory nature, because we are a blend of 27 markets. If we had allowed, take our time to see how the market develops, imagine the issue of cross-border standards on hydrogen, the issue of blending, different rules on who owns the infrastructure and who fund them. So it's not a defense of what we have to do, but there is a reason why in Europe we need to start from that, and we need to, in a way, go to market support and a market-driven approach in slightly the second chapter. And overall, another criticism often leveled to us is that this is a bit of an overregulation. There, I would say your analysis to me gives us a couple of arguments to say that maybe we have not done that bad. Number one, because when I see on the slide that the UK has indicated a temporal correlation of 30 minutes, having negotiated with some of my colleagues who are here, a temporal correlation of 1 month, I think it's actually not necessarily the strictest regulator. And second, because as Chiara has explained, the market sentiment says that overall it is a supportive framework, and I think it's also thanks to Markus Pieper that the RED III contributed to RED III is considered a supportive instrument. And always when we compare us to national or continental markets like the United States or other, of course, there is we have a price to pay, but I think also the fact that some of our legislation needs in national transposition is for me a manageable risk. I would say on funding, for instance, if you look at the slide on IRA, greater risk is some of these pipeline projects will never access the tax credit. So again, if you look at what we have done in terms of funding, which is there with Next Generation Europe, what is doing in the US, we can be less critical of the assets. Third point that comes across from the report, and I really like that part, is the KPI. Which is really, I think, a strong value added to the discussion exactly on are we on track or not. And clearly, if you look at the report, we have a similar feeling. There is quite a lot of work to do to recuperate some of the lost ground compared to where we should be in the trajectory to 2030. And there are different elements that you highlight on why we are only 3.6% of supply projects past the FDI and 4.5 on the offtake agreements and firm offtake agreements, etc. And we can find some reason. But for me, the most important element in the discussion that your report can trigger is what Europe can do now to give this extra push, this additional coordination, harmonization to bring more projects past the line, past the finishing line in the next months. And here I want to give you maybe a surprise point of view. I don't think that one of the main barriers is regulation. I do not necessarily think it's high interest rate or the financing. From our current experience, it's infrastructure. What we see, and your report is also pointing at, is that most of the projects that have gone past the finishing line, they are serving demand hubs, which are very close to the production center. And because they're using refineries or ammonia production, fertilizers, some of the steel, they're all very close to the production center or a port or an industrial cluster. There are some projects that have doubts if they will finish in time, and then they doubt whether they will do the FID. Our projects that say we are almost there, we will certainly meet the 28th deadline in the delegated act to be ready, but we are not sure that the infrastructure will be ready to serve the customers who do not want, after a statement, memorandum of principle, don't want to sign a contract. So one of our efforts at the moment is to close turbo boost the effort on infrastructure funding and planning through the CEF. I agree that we need more money there. We have already around 40 projects in the PCI list. I just was at the council, which is ongoing, at the signature of the Southern H2 corridor between Italy, Germany, and Austria, connecting with African countries, another major infrastructure project. And I think we are giving an extra push on all this infrastructure in the coming cycle of the CEF. The other thing that I can announce today is that I think next Monday we will come out with a first step to operationalize the pilot mechanism for the market development in hydrogen that is enshrined in the gas package. And it's a mechanism for transparency, for collecting information on who is there on the demand, who needs hydrogen in Europe, and who's there on the supply. And this will serve us to fine-tune our, not only the options of the bank, but also the work on infrastructure. And I think this type of mechanism, for instance, will be completely indifferent to the nature of the hydrogen, whether it is low carbon or hydrogen. We will still have to define size characteristics. But I think it's also an indication together with the delegated act on low carbon on that we're moving towards the technological neutrality and flexibility that you have mentioned. I just finished with last remark. I found that the one of the most eye-opening part of the report is the part on the clean on the electrolyzer supply chain and the manufacture, because it's very clear and a very clear warning that unless we are able to promote and protect our producers, we will be very soon confronted with the same situation where we have solar sector for 10 years, we have in the wind sector now, and this morning I was at the Europa Cable meeting. They're also seeing on electricity cable, HVDC, etc. So I think in the way going forward, the elements you give will be very important to fine-tune our trade defense instruments and policy positive support. Another thing that the commissioner will do is flying to Japan. A number of CEOs of companies, including Air Liquide, for a business forum with Japan. And we are creating also a working group to compare our Net Zero Industry Act with their own legislation on promoting clean technologies and making sure that we have clean tech supply chains not dominated by one country or by creating dependence. I close here. I was long as a sign of appreciation for the report because I do think that the elements you have in the report are worth a policy discussion, and I hope that many will read it and will contribute to the discussion on how to take forward the hydrogen agenda in the next month. Thank you.
Can we quote you to our door?
Yes, sir.
No, but that was indeed a very complete and yes, it's sometimes we need to balance between speakers, but sometimes the speakers are so eloquent and so interesting in your remarks, and also appreciate that it's very difficult to kind of think of stopping anybody. It really is. I mean, what I really am impressed by your reference to infrastructure. So the infrastructure, also the electric distribution infrastructure, are major targets for what is happening right now in Europe, and a big amount of resources going into that. Last but not least, Szymon Bieliński. We have, yes, speaking at ERCST, when I started the ERCST, I went 3 places. I went to Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw. And our relationship with the government of Poland has been very good. You know that Krzysztof Bolesta is one of yours, kind of.
He's in the council.
Well, he's in the council. We know he's in the council. We know that. And we appreciate Szymon taking the time and joining us. Szymon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you for the invitation to this keynote speech. Unfortunately, Minister Bolesta couldn't be today with us because he has some other duties. And I would like to congratulate the author of the reports, because the report provides us, the readers, a great overview on the hydrogen economy. And what is more important, it also gives us the great insight into the trends and regulation in the EU and UK. Well, it is very important for me as a government official and for others regulatory bodies. And what I like the most in this report are the numbers, because nowadays we had many discussions about hydrogen all around the world, but very often there is a lack of numbers in these debates. The quantitative data show us how demanding the pathway to hydrogen economy will be, but also demonstrates us that taking on this challenge is worth the effort. I would like today underline the 4 aspects from the report. The first aspect is technological neutrality. The hydrogen molecules do not have colors. We very often underline that we should support all low emission hydrogen production technologies. We should discuss about the level of this emission or how to count the emission. But the fact is that for today, electrolytic hydrogen is the most expensive. In the report, the price of €5 per 1 kilogram of hydrogen is indicated, but for Poland, the price is, as for today, according to our estimate, more than €12. So this is very high price, and this price could focus could influence on the competitiveness of our economy and could have an influence, for example, for the price of the food, because we use a lot of hydrogen in the chemical industry. The second aspect from this report that I see is in the report, there is a thought that maybe some industrial process should be carried out in regions of the world with the lowest cost renewable power, rather than importing low carbon hydrogen. And I think that I'm not in line with such thinking, because it creates the risk of deindustrialization of some parts of EU or some countries of EU. And we should rather support the competitiveness of our common industry, and we should be also focused on support industry in the different parts of European Union. I agree with one of the conclusion that there is not enough progress on rising domestic supply and demand. We should create the incentives for the off-takers to use low carbon hydrogen and start to deploy sufficient infrastructure for hydrogen. And it was mentioned by the previous speaker. The infrastructure for hydrogen is very important to connect producers and off-takers, and we see in Poland and we see in all other parts of European Union. And of course, the regulation are very important, and it's also in the report they're also shown. Hydrogen markets as for today does not exist, like natural gas market or electricity market. So preparing a regulatory framework is not easy. We can use our experience from other energy markets, like we did with the European Commission during the work on the hydrogen gas package. But there is the risk of overregulation, and which could lead us to miss targets. Last week in Poland, we introduced amendments to our energy law to public consultation. These changes are necessary for the development of hydrogen economy in Poland, and we try to introduce new provisions about the hydrogen. We of course used some provision from the hydrogen gas package, but it's not fully implementation. But it is very important today to adopt such changes, because, for example, we will be able to certify the operator of hydrogen distribution system or other hydrogen systems, and it will be very important to deploy the infrastructure in Poland. Now we are waiting for the opinion of industry, because the regulation are for the industry. So once again, congratulations on this very interesting report. Thank you for opportunity to share my thoughts on this, and I wish you a very fruitful meeting in the Brussels and very fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bilicki, and thank you very much for joining us today. And our thanks also to Krzysztof, that I know we're busy in the council today. We'll now like to, we're slightly behind time. That's an understatement. And we now need to invite our panelists here. So I'll go to Yellow Flores is here, Pauline and Rainer. So in your own place.
I get no, I can't.
Okay. Again, we're slightly behind time. We thank the keynote speakers. I saw, first of all, happy to see after all this, the baby being born. It has taken a while, a bit of effort, but it looks like a nice baby. So Adolfo, you go first, and then David, Flores, Pauline, and Rainer.
Thank you, Andrei, and thanks for inviting us to speak. So I'm from Eurofer, the European Film Association. I was actually at the audience roughly a month ago when you presented your reports on the ETS. I remember discussions about whether the ETS now with 25 years old, whether it was getting adult or still young. Here I have the feeling more of a baby shower. We don't know yet whether the hydrogen economy is born. We are not here to celebrate the gender, but at least we are still interested to know the delivery date. So when we will have the baby, the origins. So whether it will be you, extra you, what will be the price for that? Very, very important. And under which market conditions we will have that. So right now, as you know, steel is a minor player of the hydrogen market, but is supposed to become a very large player. Potentially, we estimate that steel can consume roughly 25% of hydrogen industrial consumption by 2030. This is roughly 2 million tons of hydrogen in 2030. That's what we have estimated. If it's based on electrolysis, that's roughly 165 terawatt hours of electricity required by that. So it's a big step already by 2030. Even bigger if you look at 2050. If you want to basically replace coking coal by hydrogen almost fully by 2050, which actually nowadays means more 2040 with the proposed 2040 target. That would mean 5.5 million tons of hydrogen by then. So more than 400 terawatt hours of electricity. All this to say that even though steel right now represents a minor player in the market, actually it will play a growing role, provided that the conditions are there. This is a fundamental enabling condition for us. Why that? Because as you know, today steel, primary steel, actually uses coking coal as a reducing agent, very carbon intensive, on which we pay very high CO2 cost. That's the carbon pricing effect of the ETS, which provides a very clear disinvestment signal to the current assets. But what we are lacking right now is a clear investment signal for the alternative technologies. As you know, we have more than 60 projects in the pipeline by 2030. Depending on the day, you may hear very good news of new projects being added, or bad news of existing projects that will take more time. This is part of somehow of the Death Valley. And within that valley, whether we hope it's rather a life than a death valley, hydrogen price and availability will play a crucial role for steel making. That's the first remark I have, which is actually fully aligned with what Lassi was mentioning before, the infrastructure. The advantage of steel making is that you don't have hundreds of steel sites in Europe. We have a little bit more than 20. If you exclude Germany, all other member states have 1 or maximum 2 sites. Only Germany has more than 5 sites. So it's relatively big hubs of potential consumption. And the additional positive element is big hubs concentrated already with existing networks with other sectors, very frequently chemicals, power, cement, and so on. So infrastructure requirement here, we are not asking to bring hydrogen into each and every little site, but only to a very limited number of sites. Then the second argument is, of course, the price. Because when you switch from coking coal, which is an international commodity, to hydrogen, in particular electrolyzer based, you are switching basically from a global commodity to a regional one. And as you know, as long as Europe faces a competitive disadvantage in electricity pricing and cost, it will be very, very hard to convert those to make operational those investments in Europe. So here right now we are at the first step of the projects, meaning that we know, let's say, the technology solution, we know the capital investments that are required. Some state aid has been granted, quite important amounts, of course. But now the missing piece is really how to make the operational cost of these investments competitive in the international arena. You do have on one side the CBAM, which is meant to capture the most carbon intensive imports, but you also have very strong competition in low carbon steelmaking from third countries. So key question mark is whether Europe will be able to deliver those hydrogen molecules either directly produced in Europe or imported at competitive price. And here our fundamental comments, not to the report, but in general to the regulatory framework. The first one is prioritize a resource that is scarce by definition. This is a fundamental issue and reservation that we have with the current functioning, for instance, of the hydrogen bank. Ultimately, we don't want hydrogen for the sake of hydrogen. We want hydrogen for decarbonization. Steel delivers by far the highest CO2 abatement per unit of hydrogen. We have estimates by Guidehouse that in steel, when you replace coal with hydrogen, you reduce emissions roughly by 16 up to 23 kilos CO2 per kilo of hydrogen. There is no other application where hydrogen per unit of hydrogen delivers the most. So here, if we apply only a mechanism of cost efficiency, so pure economics into a market which is not a market, then we risk not having the desired environmental effective that we want. So here, it's very important that, and we are not calling for even more regulatory, but maybe better regulatory interventions, but to combine the cost efficiency of the mechanism with the environmental effectiveness of the mechanism. So in the calls, for instance, it's very important to combine just the price as a selection criteria of the project with the CO2 abated with that unit of hydrogen. Otherwise, we will be using these very few rare and expensive molecules to reduce very little CO2. That's a very fundamental issue which is linked to the prioritization. The second argument, the second major remark is pay attention both to supply and demand, in the sense that it is clear that we need to create a supply of hydrogen because that's what we are lacking. But the demand will not be there at any price of that supply, particular for sectors like steel, which are exposed at very high risk of carbon leakage and energy leakage in general. You know, under the current climate policy, we have carbon costs which are partially mitigated by free allocation, for instance, because we are exposed to international competition. Now, if you simply, let's imagine, implement a quota, the obligation of steel makers to use hydrogen in Europe, but you don't take into account at which price that hydrogen will be delivered to them, then what we used to call carbon leakage will become hydrogen leakage, in the sense that due to the cost of hydrogen, steel makers will not be competitive in Europe. So you replace one cost, carbon, with another cost, hydrogen. So the idea, and that's, I was treated by that part on the UK assessment, how to combine the supply support to the off-taker input, making sure that you also take into account of the international competition of off-takers. And the last comment, I'm staying in your time, combining very bold ambition with reality. So nice and appropriate to have very bold ambition. By the way, this ambition is only a side effect of the climate ambition. So, you know, the 20 million that you have mentioned here and there, for us, are a natural consequence of the Fit for 55 targets. We need to decarbonize steel by at least more than 30% already by 2030. But combining this ambition with then pragmatism and reality check when you are implementing the details of the rules. A couple of examples. One, when it comes to the IFNBO target implementation, we will need to keep proposal from the commission. You mentioned before summer, hopefully it's before, the weather summer, not the real summer, because in Brussels we will wait for some more time before getting the real summer. And also in the near future, in 28, when we will have the reassessment, as MEP people was saying, about reassessment of the correlation and additionality criteria. I think there will be quite a steep learning curve by then in terms of reality check, and whether any adjustment will be necessary. It will be very important to be, let's say, open-minded to this kind of assessment. I will stop there by now, and maybe we can interact later on.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, Andre. First of all, I didn't know that my team slipped my notes to Adolfo, because we're much in line, very much in line on many topics. And maybe the difference is that if for your affair today, the baby shower, for Air Liquide, it's the family expanding. In the sense that Air Liquide is a long-term experienced player in the hydrogen market, more than 60 years now. With many projects ongoing, which are of course much bigger now, especially for the steel industry in Germany. You mentioned we have a few projects there. Very recently, 20 megawatt electrolyzers in Germany, Trailblazer, not far from the Nordrhein-Westfalen for the steel industry running. Additional 10 megawatt will be added to that. Another project also in Germany, also for the steel industry, 100 megawatt called Green Merchant Steel, recently was selected in the IPCEI. So the reality of project is also that it's moving on. It's moving on. Maybe to take the ball on what you said. I would like to say that I'm very, very in line also with the fact that it all happens and will continue happening in big industrial hubs, and that we need to make sure that we optimize the production capacity in Europe first. Not because it's a political friendly political narrative before the elections, but because the beauty of hydrogen is that you can produce it locally. Of course, for that you need access to cheap, affordable, renewable and low carbon electricity. So for us, the Air Liquide, it will also be the priority to make sure, and it was said many times today, that the priority in development energy infrastructure will come to electricity grid, not necessarily to hydrogen big backbones around Europe, but first to develop the electricity grid. Second point that I wanted to make and was made also today, and I very much appreciate the UK example in this regard, is the technology neutrality and the fact that the low carbon hydrogen should be also very much incentivized, because only renewable, only RFNBO will probably not meet the target. So we need access to low carbon electricity, but also to low carbon hydrogen. We have today in Europe many hydrogen production plants that you cannot turn from one day to another, or not even before a certain date with electrolyzers, because it doesn't fit the situation. So we need to add carbon capture to that, CCU or CCUS. CCS. We have already great examples of project running for 10 or 15 years in Normandy, for example, at a hydrogen plant. Others are in FID, as Adita mentioned before, in the Netherlands. Big project there also in Almaty, in decarbonization of the Rotterdam port. So we're very happy to see the publication of the Commission for Industrial Carbon Management putting forward CCS, and we believe that applied to hydrogen would help meet the decarbonization targets. I don't want to be too long because there are many things to say from a business perspective. What we need, of course, as a producer, you mentioned it, is to make sure that we will have off-takers. So certainty, flexibility, and long-term incentives are required here. Maybe one point, if I want to make a constructive comment to the report, is I would like to see more emphasis also on decarbonization of mobility next to hydrogen. And this may be something that we can keep on working. on. I mean, heavy duty mobility will certainly require a lot of hydrogen, not only trucks, but also maritime and aviation. And we have a good basis with a solid framework now, thanks to the Fit for 55. And I think we should make sure that the member states, at member state level, we will implement this quickly, also thanks to here. So a lot to do, many projects in development, both industry and in mobility, and we can say that because we are partnering with many industries and many O&M and mobility providers on all these topics. We'll be very happy also to see the Low Carbon Delegated Act come quickly and provide level playing field when it comes to greenhouse gas emission calculation methodology. And that's it for the time being. Andre, thank you very much. Try to keep it short.
Before I turn to the electricity people, first, Florence.
Yes, thank you. And let me join the congratulations of others on your report, which I hope will become a benchmark in the coming years. Let me also congratulate Stefano and the Commission on all the work they did in the previous years to the anticipatory nature of your work has also provoked Shell to invest in an electrolyzer in Rotterdam, building on our experience in Germany with the 10 megawatts, and now we're doing a 200 megawatt that is under construction as we speak, and hopefully sometime next year we'll start testing. Let me first say something about Shell and then go back to the report. The Rotterdam project is possible because we connect our own offshore wind park that we do operate with Eneco to our own Pernis refinery. And I think this was pointed out already. This is a unique situation, which I think in the coming years will be probably where most of the growth will be seen, because it connects. It also connects to that infrastructure remark that you made that I very much agree with from where we sit. If I can say a bit about our experience in terms of cost. CAPEX is still heavily dependent on steel, cement, and of course we've seen a lot of inflation in that over the last years. Grid fees, unfortunately, have quadrupled on us. But the biggest cost element is still renewable power, where there's lots of talk about scaling up will bring benefits in cost reduction. But of course, in renewable power, a lot of that cost reduction path has already been followed. So we don't expect massive further reductions in the cost of offshore wind or solar, for instance. On the revenue side becomes then very important. And in our case, much of it is dependent on access to the refinery route, as it's called, under the RED. And full implementation of that route is for these kinds of projects and for the subsequent decarbonization of transport fuels important. I'll come back to that in a moment. So coming back to the report refers to the complex and sometimes overly regulatory nature. If we look at it in balance, I think, of course, things missing pieces are still needed, especially in the low carbon delegated tax space. But for us, it's all about implementation right now. And the implementation in the various member states shows already very different approaches between Germany and the Netherlands, for instance, but also with the French. I'm interested in hearing that the French and the Germans are now starting a conversation on how to do it. But that comes with some concerns because correct implementation of all the targets will create that demand side pool that we need to get this market going. And of course, the industry target, and I think you referred to it, the 42%, is a difficult thing to meet for the industry. So we are very sympathetic to the idea that you suggested right now. I think that's a very interesting one. Because we see, if you look further than the directly connected refineries that we work with, if you look at steel, but also other places, you need that piece of infrastructure, but you need to be able to pay the cost of the hydrogen that's being produced. And that cost, as I just mentioned, unfortunately, is not coming down very quickly at the moment. I have a few other remarks on the report itself, perhaps some constructive criticism, but that's just related to the terminology. Low carbon hydrogen, for me, has the ring with the delegated act. If you also include under that definition renewable, it becomes a bit confusing. That was my first, when I first read the report, but that's a minor detail, I would say. And the same goes for targets and ambitions. 20 million tons in the hydrogen strategy was an ambition, and I don't think it was ever scientifically really, but you are the better judge of that. The red targets are, of course, enshrined in law and need to be met by the member states. So that is an important distinction, I think, when we talk about the difference between the two. Let me leave it there. There's more. It was a very rich discussion, of which I will take many things back home as well. But I look forward to the rest of the speakers.
Pauline, I thank you all for the patience. It does go over time, but I didn't have the heart to kind of stop people because it is very interesting, one of the more probably substantive discussion that we had in a while. So, Pauline.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the report, for the opportunity to be here. So I'm Pauline, and I work for Hynamix, which is the hydrogen subsidiary of the EDF Group, Electricité de France. And what's interesting is that we are present in the UK, in France, and in Germany. So we see the all different frameworks, energy contexts, and obstacles in each country. So yeah, it's interesting to have this report and also to be able to speak here. What I take as key takeaway from your report is that the EU is doing a lot in fundings, in regulation compared to the world. So that's a good thing. That's an optimistic thing. But we don't see the projects coming. So second takeaway is actually there is not enough offtake. We don't manage to like make the demand supply meet. It's not a commodity. We know that. So we could wonder, and I think I would like today to give like the point of view of the producer, because we are trying to do projects here. So when we go to the industry, of course, it's difficult to make offtake contracts because we give them a product which is expensive, we've seen that, or which is variable because we depend from renewable electricity, which is variable. So yeah, of course, they would like to have something which is almost as cheap as what they are buying now, and especially actually a product which is constant, so they can like produce also on a constant basis. But that's difficult for us. Especially I would give 3 examples. When we go to PPA producers, so renewable energy producer, and we tell them all the constraints we have with additionality, with correlation, etc., they actually would rather make a contract with someone else, with someone who has less constraints, actually. So that's first thing is difficult. And I agree with you. We need a lot of electricity right now to produce this hydrogen, but we can't use the electricity which is here, which would be nuclear, which would be renewable after 2030 without additionality. So it's complicated. The second thing is it's difficult to manage this electricity due to all the constraints. If you look at, for example, for 100 megawatt electrolyzers, you would need to contract 200 megawatts of electricity to make a combination of wind, a combination of solar, maybe hydro if you get your project for 2028. So this is like oversourcing. You need more capacity of renewable than your own electrolyzers. And then this surplus of electricity, when the wind is blowing and when the sun is shining, you have to sell it back to the market. According to our data, that would be 20% more OPEX costs. Could be 12 million per year for 100 megawatts if you don't manage this utilization. So it's also a lot. And that's when we go to the market. We say, okay, either we have a variable product or we have this product which is matching the RFNBO criteria, but which is so expensive. And obviously, off-takers say, yeah, maybe not. Maybe we will think about it. We will wait that the network, the infrastructure will be there. So we just connect we'll just plug and get our hydrogen like that. So we don't have the risk of not having a constant supply. And maybe in 5 years, it's going to be less expensive. The thing is, if every off-taker say that, who is going to be the first project to make this cost going down? So that's the dilemma we are in right now. And yeah, I think what would be really interesting, would be really important is, first of all, to be able to use the electricity, which is here, so decarbonized grid. We've talked about the 30 minutes correlation from the UK. Actually, 30 minutes correlation is good. It's avoiding greenwashing, but they are just looking at the carbon threshold. They are not looking at the renewable producing or not. So actually, we would be in favor of that if there was just this carbon threshold. Second thing, we would need a certainty about offtake. So as a producer, it's important to have this RFNBO quotas or low carbon hydrogen quotas, so that we are sure that the industry has a real incentive to do that. And on the other side, the industry has to be helped. So we would need guarantees, like third-party guarantees, to make sure that the contracts are guaranteed in the meaning that if the supply is not coming, they can carry on producing. If our uptake is insolvent, we can carry on having revenues. That would be something. And the last thing, it would be to ease production. So I think, yeah, the idea of cost per ton CO2 avoided is a good one. Allowing grid electricity as long as it complies with the CO2 threshold it's really important. It's using the electricity, the carbon electricity which is here, or maybe just allowing pay as nominated contract, PPAs contract. It would be at least allow to have a bit more previsibility and not to make 24/7 correlation. We would have a early correlation, but based on forecast, day-ahead forecast. So that would be an idea. We have many ideas how we could do that. So I will just stop here. But yeah, thank you very much for this discussion.
We also look very much forward to the definition of low carbon hydrogen, and hopefully that will help the cause. Rainer, thank you very much. We have worked together. We did together with you and Bloomberg. Very interesting event here. I think in March was it. I had to miss it because I was traveling, but please have the floor, and I apologize. I mean, let you wait.
No worries. Thank you very much, Andre. So I'm Rainer Kutzer from the Research Institute for Sustainability. So after the industry and the policy people, I'm going to give sort of a perspective from research myself. I also think it's a very useful and a great report that adds a lot to the debate. I very much like the combination of policy and outcome indicators as a way of looking at things and tracking progress, and also like the simplicity, which you have a certain number of KPIs, which kind of provides an accessible way to look at progress. I still think there might be some additional indicators or KPIs that would be interesting, such things like costs and prices, for example. Progress on infrastructure. We talked a lot about infrastructure, but there's no KPI on infrastructure. I think it is actually useful to have the environmental part separate from the other KPIs, because again, it makes it clear what that part of the report is about, and that's actually one area where additional granularity might be interesting. You took an average leakage rate for CCS of 60%, and would be very interesting to kind of incorporate in the years to come, maybe real data on leakage rates to really understand what the environmental benefits of blue hydrogen in this case are, what the contribution to decarbonization is, and not just have a sort of very broad or rough estimate for that. And I also think it would be valuable to maybe think about products looking and comparing. In a way, this is a report comparing the EU and the UK, and it would be very interesting, for example, to look at the US in more detail, and China in more detail. In terms of the policy recommendations, I think the first one is a big one and a very important one, the implementation gap. And we have all these regulations that are telling member states what they need to do. They need to use more renewable hydrogen in industry and transport. But then, how is this actually going to happen? Is this implementation going to happen? And there's a lot of doubts. Maybe not in Germany as much as but in many other member states, which means that this implementation gap we're talking about is also a risk of a very uneven development of this hydrogen economy in Europe. And I think that's a risk for many different reasons. And I think it means that we need to really underpin this regulatory approach with a financing and an investment-oriented approach at the European level. So we close the implementation gap, and we also avoid an uneven deployment of hydrogen. We need it where the industry is now, but maybe we also need it where it would make sense to build up new industry based on renewable resources in the future. For example, what's happening, I think, to a certain extent in Spain right now. And finally, maybe one word of caution. We've already talked about this. Technological neutrality. I think I would sort of caution against calling for that too strongly and too sort of in this broad sense. I mean, the fact that we're talking about a hydrogen sector, it means that we all agree that it's important to talk about specific technological sectors. Hydrogen is a technological sort of area, and if we agree that it's important to talk about it, that means we agree that there's some need to talk about technology-specific measures. And so I think it's not really so much about whether we want a completely neutral sort of approach, or about where, at which level, and in which instruments we want specificity and where we don't want specificity. And the risk, I think, of, say, opening up things too much and sort of going to an entirely technological neutral approach within hydrogen is that, I mean, we saw the graph on the US, which was sort of dominated by blue hydrogen. We saw Europe, which was more balanced, but more on the green hydrogen side. And then we had China, which is entirely on the green hydrogen side, right? In terms of the actual deployment, which suggests very strongly that China has a very strongly technological specific policy that is investing heavily in green hydrogen because they want to win the green hydrogen race. And if we open things up too much for the lowest cost option, and we don't focus on really bringing down the costs, and actually one of the things you call for is to bring down the cost of renewable hydrogen. If we want to bring down the cost of renewable hydrogen, we need some policies to do that. And those will have to be specific to renewable hydrogen, because if we let renewable hydrogen compete completely openly with low carbon hydrogen, we risk that the investment will shift very strongly in that direction. And I don't think that is the objective either, which is not to say that I'm saying CCS shouldn't play a role. I think CCS should play a role and has to play a role in the decarbonization of industry in Europe. But we need policies also to bring down the cost of renewable hydrogen fast, so that we can be competitive in that race, that we can deploy electrolyzers and bring down the cost and have a competitive electrolyzer industry also in Europe. And I'll finish there.
Well, look, thank you very much. But if we all agreed on everything, how much fun would this be? I mean, this would be not fun enough. And, I mean, maybe a scary thought that the market may decide on what are the winning solutions. I'm speaking for ERCST now, where we are a lot more convinced that in the end, the invisible hands of the market will make it, and whether Whether the Chinese compete on a fair basis or not, that's a different story. But we are out of time and I'm chairing. That makes it a little bit difficult and demanding for me to react to this. I tell you what, I mean, I would like just as a gesture and to follow to one, if there's one question from the room as a gesture, because I know this is not the way it should be, but is there, you all want to go home or is there one question from the floor? The gentleman at the back, you're the winner, you're the one, the winning ticket. If you want to stand up and speak loudly, because they have this very sophisticated stuff here, the microphones are in the ceiling.
I'll be quick, as I mentioned. This is Stefano Grandi from Energy Trades Europe, previously known as CFET. Thank you for the very nice snapshot. My question was a bit more looking ahead. So I want to ask you to the experts as well the commission, how do you envisage the development of hydrogen market in the future? Is it going to be more a cluster model or more a hydrogen backbone model according to you? Or please don't tell me both at the same time because it's not feasible for me, but that was the question.
Well, look, I mean, it is a fair question, and I think that I'm just turning to anybody who wants to answer this, as long as it's a short answer. So I think there's probably different visions of this, but short, just keep it short. You want to start, David?
Yeah, sure. Our vision at Air Liquide is that it starts with industrial hubs, because it's as you mentioned, Adolfo, that you can combine the demand, and what we need, and it was said by Pauline, is demand, and we need more demand. And this is why we should organize the production and optimize production in Europe first to be able to feed these industrial hubs in the future. If you have more production here, less here, you can play, and more demand at some point and less at then you can use the links between them. So that's how we see things.
Thank you.
Anyone else wants to pick up on this? I think that you would agree to this. No.
Quite, let's say,
Okay.
difficulty.
Difficult, yes. I recognize the difficulty. Okay, in that case, I don't see anyone else. Listen, let me thank again our partners. Let me thank the speakers. Let me thank Olivier, and also thank Chiara and Gabriele for the last day with us today. So anyway, thank you all for staying this late. Must have been somewhat interesting if you stayed this late, and we'll take it from here. Thanks a lot.